Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 12, The Later Dynasties of China. So you'll recall early in last lecture we discussed the Mongols and how they invaded Persia and even around the Danube in the west, but then they also invaded China. And when they invaded, they began to rule China. Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he in fact was the reigning Great Khan, so he was the Khan over the whole Golden Horde, had been ruling China for years. And finally, in 1271, he officially proclaimed himself Emperor of China. He did the traditional Chinese ceremonies, and so he proclaimed himself Emperor of China, said that he had the mandate of heaven, which is, basically the divine right to rule. And when he did this, he founded what is called the Yuan Dynasty. Kublai Khan had surrounded himself with Chinese advisors to help him ease the transition between native Chinese rule and these Mongol rulers. And one of the ways that that these Chinese advisors helped him was that they helped incorporate the existing Chinese bureaucracy. So the Yuan rulers used this bureaucracy to help them maintain control over China. Basically, they just kind of inserted themselves into the upper levels of the bureaucracy, and the lower levels were filled with Chinese people. Now that's generally what happened. The Mongols in the upper levels, the Chinese in the lower levels. But the most trusted advisors of the emperor were really determined based on merit. So governors and advisors of Kublai Khan were actually, they could be Chinese, they could be Korean, they could be non-Mongol foreigners like Muslims, some Jewish people. So a diverse court around him, right next to him. His closest advisors could be mixed, and like I said, it was based on merit. But in general, what we see are the Mongols in the upper levels of the bureaucracy, and the native Chinese in the lower levels. Kublai Khan also had China use paper money. This here is an actual yuan print. So this is the printing mold, and then you can see an example of what the paper money from it would be. There were many different religions practiced in China during the Yuan, and they had varying restrictions on some of them. For example, the Jewish and Muslim populations were not allowed to butcher animals in the way that their religion told them to. But in general, some tolerance there, and enough that many different religions were throughout China during this time. The Muslim population were especially important in bringing new innovations to the Yuan dynasty. They were actually brought in to help spur technology and science. And here we actually see a Muslim trebuchet that was invented during the Yuan dynasty. And they also helped with medicine and math, as did people of many different backgrounds, not just Muslims, but Muslims were specifically brought in for, to help spur innovations in science. But throughout the entire empire, there were many different peoples of many different backgrounds who helped create these advancements in science and art. The arts, like I said, were especially advancing, and the porcelain and poetry were the major types of arts that flourished during the Yuan dynasty. And here we can see a Yuan porcelain piece. The Yuan dynasty held a massive amount of land, and in order to maintain control in China and the rest of their empire, they put some restrictions on the Chinese people. They didn't allow them to have freedom of assembly. The general population of Chinese people were disarmed, and curfews were instated. So, people couldn't stay out so late. These were all kind of ways that they could maintain control. You put these restrictions on people. It's the thought is that it helps prevent rebellions and revolts. But restrictions, while they can help logistically keep down rebellions, they also make people resentful. And especially when the rulers are foreigners, as in the case here, where you have Mongols ruling over native Chinese people, the restrictions can kind of backfired and made the people very resentful of the foreign rulers. And much like we saw in the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the power of the emperor in China in the Yuan dynasty began to be weakened due to political rivalries, fights for succession, and also just emperors seeming to lose interest in ruling. And another problem with the Yuan dynasty was that the size of the empire, made it expensive to maintain. You have to defend all that area. You have to make sure people are watching over it for you. They had to print more money, more of that paper money, which led to inflation. In the 1330s and 1340s, there were also many different types of natural disasters that happened. The Black Plague started to spread through Asia, and as many as 25 million people died during it. There were also floods along the Yellow River and some of the other rivers in China. And still other parts of the state were experiencing droughts, and some years there could be floods, other years there could be droughts, and this all came together to greatly disrupt the growing of crops. Right, you throw off the cycle of growing crops, and then also when you lose that many people in the Black Plague, the workforce was lessened. So this resulted in famine, and because of the famines and the hard times that people were feeling, that led to rebellions. And then, since you have people rebelling, creating a lot of chaos, that leads to more famines, which then leads to bigger and bigger rebellions, and it's kind of this circular, circular thing that's happening. And finally, there was a major rebellion that was called the Red Turban Rebellion, and it was the one that successfully overthrew the Yuan dynasty. Now, it overthrew the Yuan dynasty in China, but the Yuan dynasty just kind of moved. They moved north, and they still controlled the areas in Mongolia. They just didn't rule China anymore. So there was still a northern Yuan empire just above China, and they would kind of be a looming threat for for the Chinese. Still, they were still just always kind of on the horizon. Now, a major figure in this rebellion was a man named Zhu Yuanzhang. He was born to a poor peasant family, and in fact his family was so poor that several of his siblings were given away because they didn't have enough food to feed them. And then when you add in the famine of the late Yuan dynasty, actually all of his family was killed except for him and his brother. So, a man who's deeply affected by, the poor reign of the later Yuan dynasty. And once his family died, he wandered China as a beggar, and in doing this, he saw all the other hardships that other people were facing too. It wasn't just him who experienced such hardships. He saw it throughout China. Eventually, he ended up staying with some Buddhist monks at a temple, spent a few years there, and he even thought about becoming a monk. He learned to read and write while with the monks, but he didn't become a monk because the temple was actually destroyed by a Yuan army that was putting a revolt down in the area. Once they destroy this temple, he's seen just how bad these famines are under these emperors. Now their armies are just destroying temples and, putting down rebellions forcefully. He decided then to join a rebelling force that would later join in with the group that became the Red Turbans. During his time in the Red Turbans, he became a leader of the rebellion. And once the Yuan were driven out of China, Zhu was able to seize the mandate of heaven, and proclaim himself emperor. So he then said that the divines have chosen me to rule, and now I am the rightful emperor. And he called his era of rule the Hongwu era, which means roughly greatly martial era. And I'm just gonna refer to him as by the name of his era, Hongwu. So I'm just gonna call him Hongwu from now on. Because he grew up poor, Hongwu generally distrusted nobles and other large landowners, which isn't surprising. And he made those who fought with him in the rebellion, he gave them noble titles, but didn't really give them the lands that went along with being a noble. But they at least got the title of being a noble. So some of these distrusted nobles are being replaced by these people who fought with Hongwu. His poor background as his poor peasant background also made it so that he believed that agriculture was the only way for someone to gain wealth. That's the only way that someone should gain wealth. And this kind of followed along the Confucianist views and ideas that merchants were kind of like parasites. The agriculture was what was noble. Confucianist thought also had him place these scholars, these Confucianist scholars, in charge of the generals. The generals themselves just held temporary power during war, and once their section of the war was done, they had to give the power back to the emperor, and he could redistribute it out as he pleased. Kind of like what we saw in the Ottoman Empire with the Timar, those little pieces of land, and how those pieces of land came back to the emperor, or back to the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire. Here, the power of the generals to lead an army goes back to the emperor after their duty. I told you that the Yuan dynasty remained in Mongolia, as this northern Yuan empire. So Hongwu stationed a large army. He had a large army ready to repel these attacks by the Yuan dynasty, and he kind of had to make sure that the northern border was pretty secure. As emperor, Hongwu demanded obedience from his advisors and from the people. There were many different people who were killed because they resisted him. And oftentimes people could be tortured publicly. to kind of get to spread the idea that you have to obey the emperor, and if you don't, this is what will happen to you. And along the same lines, he really wanted to be in control, so he actually moved the whole capital of China from Beijing down to Nanjing. So Beijing is up in the north, Nanjing is down in the south. And Nanjing had, a history of being a capital of China, but it hadn't been so for a while. And so he's moving it back here, a place that doesn't have any associations with the old Yuan dynasty. This is really, a new capital for a new emperor is kind of the idea. So when Hongwu became emperor, he founded what is called the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty, if we wanted to summarize its government, we would describe it as decentralized. What do we mean by that? Well, the regions were really in charge of, running themselves and really just self-reliant. Like, regions were in charge of collecting their own taxes. And since they were in charge of collecting their own taxes, this could lead to a lot of confusion on the national level, right? How are the national tax collectors going to know how much they should be getting from these? So there could be some confusion there, allowing the regions to collect their own taxes, and it also presented the potential for corruption, right? Who's to say that one of these regional tax collectors just doesn't take an extra share and hold on to it and just doesn't report it to the national, the people in charge of the national taxes. In general, infrastructure was also in the control of the locals, which can be good, right? I mean, if you have a road in your town, the locals are going to be the ones who really want it to be well maintained. But again, there's some drawbacks to this in the sense that there's no central authority for bigger picture projects. So you have that road that's nice through the town, but what about just outside it? Or, how it connects to the other town? They're not going to care that as much about the part that connects to another town as they care about the one that actually goes through their town. And then there's also a potential for corruption there too. Right, you get some money to fix up a road, and you embezzle some of that money, and just spend a little bit on it. Now, early in the Ming Dynasty, they continued to print paper money, but this led to inflation. So they tried to use silver as currency, but there were going to be some problems with that. First off, the price of silver in the world market started to go down because the Spanish kept finding new sources of silver in the New World, and that lowered the price throughout the world market. But and I'm going to get into this a little bit later. The Spanish also then tried to control silver, which made it hard for the Chinese to get a hold of. So the price was down in general, but it was kind of high in China and just not really getting there. And like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The Ming Dynasty can also be described as having a greater emphasis on Confucianism. So Confucianism began to play a greater role in the state again under the Ming Dynasty. And Confucianism it's really kind of hard to describe describe how it is, or define it. It's kind of like a way of life, a philosophy, a way of governing, all kind of blended in to this one idea that we call Confucianism, that originally came from a 5th century BCE philosopher who in the West we call Confucius. and basically preached that society was based on hierarchies. And in these hierarchies that society was based on, everyone had their place in the order. On the family level, when as far down as the family level, the father was the head of the household, and he had to be obeyed. On a national level, the emperor was the father of the country, so in turn, everyone must obey him, right? And it's obvious why an emperor would find these ideas of Confucianism appealing, right? If it's saying that everybody should obey the emperor of course is going to like that. Mentioned this slightly before, Confucianism also felt that agriculture should be the sole source of accumulating wealth. So, in fact, agriculture was the true and noble profession. Merchants were viewed as thieves or parasites, and basically the way that everyone should be living is as a farmer. During the Ming Dynasty, the imperial examination system also played a larger role again. The examination system itself can be traced back to, between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, so all the way back to the Han Dynasty. And over all of those years, it kind of coalesced into this system that was based on education using literature and philosophy. And the philosophy was especially Confucian philosophy. And this examination system was used to fill all the levels of the Chinese bureaucracy, from the lower district to the higher provincial, and all the way up to the metropolitan or national levels. So there were all these different examinations that you could take to become, first off, a district bureaucrat, then a provincial, then maybe a metropolitan, and then even a palatial one. Kublai Khan, at the start of the Yuan dynasty, actually decided to stop the examination system altogether because he didn't believe that Confucianism was necessary for public officials. It was later brought back by the 4th Yuan emperor, and like I said, this system was greatly expanded during the Ming Dynasty. These exams were, by our standards, pretty strenuous. Usually they were held in isolated rooms, sometimes they were cubicles, and students would spend 3 days and 2 nights in these small little rooms, with only a few amenities that they brought with them: food, water, a chamber pot to go to the bathroom, and some bedding. And here we can see in this picture, these are the little tiny rooms along the hall. This is where those people would stay for 3 days and 2 nights. At the highest level, the exams were very, very difficult. Only 1 to 2% of the students who took them passed the highest national exams. So we saw the cubicles, and here's a painting, a Ming painting of the men who took the exams waiting to see their results. They would be posted on these on walls, so they were just waiting there to find out whether they had passed or not. Whether those 3 days and 2 nights were worth it, or whether they would have to do it again at a later date to try and enter the bureaucracy. Given Hongwu's desire to be obeyed, as well as his reliance on Confucianism, it's not surprising that during the Ming Dynasty, the emperor was the focal point of all society. In general, emperors were wary of their high officials, so the office of prime minister was completely removed during the Ming Dynasty. The emperor wanted to be the one with power, with all the power, so the prime minister removed. The provinces were going to be held by either the sons of the emperor, or if not them, then other family members who are closely related to the emperor. Now, just because they were family members, and like I said, mainly sons, that doesn't mean that they could do whatever they wanted. They were closely watched by the emperor too. Just because your son is in charge doesn't mean he's going to be completely loyal, or so they're closely watched. This moving away from high officials also opened up some opportunities for a different class in society. These were the eunuchs. Now, a eunuch is a male who has been castrated, and in fact, Hong Wu really hated and distrusted the eunuchs. He felt that during the other dynasties, the previous dynasties, the eunuchs had been too strong. So he really limited their power. But during the reigns of the other Ming emperors, again, the eunuchs became quite powerful. And this is in part due to the distrust of high officials, right, and nobility. You have to fill in the bureaucracy somehow. You have to fill in those around you. So eunuchs filled that gap. And it kind of makes sense, because the main idea is that, well, if a man can't have children, then he wouldn't be ambitious, right? Because he doesn't have anybody to pass on things to. And in theory, that kind of makes sense. But at the same time, it's not surprising that this didn't work out too well. That, in fact, eunuchs would become very powerful and would be ambitious. Because, just because you don't have children doesn't mean you're not going to be ambitious and want more. So it's not surprising that eunuchs came to be very ambitious and very powerful during the Ming Dynasty. And here we can see the Ming Emperor surrounded by his many eunuchs there. Also not surprising, agriculture was the base of the economy, right? If they believe so strongly in Confucianism and the idea that everyone should be farmers, it's not surprising that agriculture then is the base of the economy. Now, in China, there were two main crops. In the north, around like Beijing and whatnot, they grew wheat. But in the south, they grew rice. During the Ming Dynasty, a new type of rice was introduced to Chinese rice paddies, and this was called champa rice. Champa rice matured in 60 days instead of 100, and that meant that you could get roughly 2 harvests in the same amount of time, right? 60 days is times 2 is 120, so it's roughly close. So you can get 2 harvests in around the same amount of time. And this meant that during the growing season, you could get 2 times the amount of food, right? If you have 2 harvests, that means that you have twice the amount of food that you used to be able to produce. During the Ming Dynasty, the emperors also would move people from the more populated areas to the less populated areas in order to make use of all this land that China had. The idea was that they could, if more people were living on more land, then they could make more crops. They could then be wealthier as a nation. These areas could be terraced and supplied with irrigation. Here we see the Longsheng rice terraces in Guangxi. So you can see the terraces full of rice paddies there. And it goes all the way around like this. Really, really amazing stuff that they were able to do. And in these rice paddies, during the Ming Dynasty, fish were also introduced. And there were three main benefits to adding fish to rice paddies. One was that, when they go to the bathroom, they fertilize the rice. Two, the fish eat the mosquito larvae, so you have less mosquitoes flying around. And then you can also then eat the fish, right? So they added a different protein to the diet. So that's kind of like what they did based in agriculture. They also were known for reforestation, which is kind of, similar to agriculture. In fact, it was estimated that, it's an insane amount of trees. It's like 50 million trees were planted just in the area of Nanjing by Hongwu. So, lots of reforestation in China during the Ming emperors as well. The fourth son of Hongwu would serve as the governor of a frontier province, and it was the frontier along the border of the Northern Yuan Empire. And later he would go on to become the third Ming emperor. He named his era the Yongle era. And again, like Hongwu, I'm just going to call him Yongle. He is the emperor who moved the capital back to Beijing. So he moved it from Nanjing back to Beijing. And when he did so, he had what would be called the Forbidden City built. And here you can see like an overhead plan of the Forbidden City right over here. It took over 1 million workers over 14 years to build. It was a walled complex within Beijing, roughly 0.6 by 0.5 miles, so over 180 square acres. There were 980 buildings, and you can see some of them here. So this is the Forbidden City, built by Yongle. And this would serve as the home of the emperor, and his household, as well as the ceremonial center for China. If any big ceremonies had to happen, they would often take place in the Forbidden City. Yongle also renovated the Grand Canal, which was the main waterway that connected the north and the south. It had been built in much earlier Chinese history. Yongle renovates it because he saw how important it was. It was used for shipping grain back and forth. It was also used for the imperial post. So, if you had mail to send, important, directions and whatnot, the Grand Canal was a great way to do that. And, even though trade was de-emphasized, people still traded. So it was still important for trade. In the renovations, Yongle had it so that the water levels of the Grand Canal were regulated through dams, reservoirs, canal locks. He also had the porcelain tower built, and this was built in Nanjing, and it sometimes was considered a wonder of the world. Unfortunately, it was destroyed during the Taiping Rebellion in 1856, which we will mention in a later lecture, or discuss in more detail in a later lecture. But he built this from in Nanjing, so he moved the capital to Beijing. This was built in Nanjing. And here we can actually see an original arched door of the porcelain tower that's been pieced back together and is in a museum. Would have been an amazing building to see, but unfortunately, like I said, destroyed during the Taiping Rebellion. Young Law also was responsible for sponsoring the exploration trips of Zheng He. Zheng He visited many different areas in the region, in Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, Africa. I mean, you can just see how far he goes. So, setting sail in Nanjing, and he just kind of goes around the coast, goes into Indonesia, goes through the Straits of Malacca, right? And hits up here into like the area around Burma, lands in India, all around the Arabian Peninsula, even Mecca, and those Swahili city-states there. And he's doing this in 1405. So this is 90 years before the Portuguese show up. Here we can see one of his sailing charts. This is India in the top left. This is Sri Lanka in the top right. And this mass down at the bottom, that is Africa. We can also see a giraffe that was brought from the journeys of Zheng He. So, during the Ming Dynasty, the people in the north were actually always a threat to China. Not just during the Ming Dynasty, but even for just countless years. Basically all of Chinese history, people from the north were a threat to China. And in fact, you'll remember that the Great Wall was begun by the very first emperor of China in the 3rd century BCE. Here we see how the wall looks today, right here. And in fact, this owes a lot to the Ming Dynasty, because it was during the Ming Dynasty that the Great Wall was made stronger. Before, it had been mainly just an earthen boundary, so they had just kind of piled up dirt and made it a wall that way. But during the Ming Dynasty, they replaced that with they replaced those piles of dirt with stone and with brick. And they also then extended the wall west. And when they did extend the wall west, they decided not to just follow the path of the Yellow River anymore. Instead, they followed the edge of the desert. And you can see here, see how it just kind of skirts along the edge of the desert? So that just on the other side were very bad conditions, right? It's an extra layer of protection. You can't really lay siege in the middle of a desert, because you're going to run out of food. They also added watchtowers along the wall, and it's estimated that there were up to 25,000 towers on the wall that the Ming Dynasty finished renovating and improving. During the Ming Dynasty, the main threats from the north were early on the Mongols, who again still ruled the area as the Northern Yuan Dynasty. But over time, they lost power and even were going to be consumed by the Manchus. And here we can see where the Manchus are. So the Northern Yuan Dynasty would have been right up here, having to cross the Gobi Desert to get back into the Ming Dynasty. Whoop. There we go. And so, so that's where the Northern Yuan Dynasty was. But over time, the Manchus became more powerful. It was the constant threat of invasion from the north especially once the Manchus did, unite and rise up, that was a real pain in the side of the Ming Dynasty, and they had to constantly spend for defense against it. They had to constantly keep troops along those watchtowers that they built. And so that was one of the factors in the fall of the Ming Dynasty. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There also was that early on when they were still using the paper currency, there was a lot of inflation. So then when they tried to switch to silver, it hurt them in two different ways. One in the sense that, again, like I said, the Spanish had discovered more silver in the New World, so the price of silver in the world market started to go down. But at the same time, Spain was trying to keep that silver from getting out of Spanish lands, so it made it harder for the Chinese to obtain this silver. So not only was the price lower, but at the same time it was harder to get for the Chinese, which is contradictory in a lot of ways, in terms of the laws of supply and demand. Another thing that really hurt the Ming Dynasty occurred during the reign of the Wanli Emperor. And again, this is what he gave the name to his era, so I'm just going to call him Wanli. During his time as emperor, early on, he was very involved in governing. He tried really hard and did a decent job. But over time, he grew tired of the political quarrels and the troubles that came around from people trying to get more power and just the intrigues of governing. And so what he did was he grew tired of it. Instead, he decided that he would withdraw to his palace in the Forbidden City, and he would no longer attend meetings, wouldn't really govern in any way imaginable. He just let his obligations slip. He just didn't care. And again, like we saw with the nobles earlier on in the Ming Dynasty, the eunuchs were the ones who kind of filled this void. So the eunuchs began really to govern in his place. And again, they were very ambitious, so they used their power mainly to help themselves and to gain wealth. Early in the 17th century, there was also a little ice age. This led to colder and drier weather, which shortened the growing seasons. So, with shorter growing seasons, you get less crops and less developed crops, and this resulted in famines. There then was also an epidemic that broke out. It may have been smallpox, but some sort of disease spread throughout China and was killing a lot of people. So we see, again, famine and disease spreading, and just like with the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the famines lead to rebellions, and another major rebellion takes place, this one led by Li Zicheng. Li Zicheng was a peasant soldier, so again, kind of sounding a little bit like Hong Wu here. He led this large rebellion, and in 1644, he successfully captured Beijing. Once he took Beijing, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hanged himself. This is the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen. When Li Zicheng came in, he hanged himself, and Li Zicheng declared himself emperor. So we have this new emperor, at least proclaimed, but the people who were still loyal to the Ming didn't really support this guy who led a peasant rebellion, and upon hearing it, that there was this new emperor, one of the generals of the Ming a guy named Wu Sangui, decided that he would open the gates of the Great Wall and let the Manchus into China. The idea was that they would work together to remove this rebellion, to put down the rebellion, to remove this pretender emperor. And the Manchus said that they were there in China to avenge the emperor. When Li Zicheng was defeated, the Manchus, not surprisingly, didn't return power to the Ming. And instead what they did was they founded their own dynasty. They declared themselves emperor. The leader of the Manchus declared himself emperor, took the mandate of heaven, and was in a better position to kind of hold on to it. So we now have a new Qing dynasty founded with this emperor being proclaimed. Now, some Chinese, just like we saw with Li Zicheng, didn't agree that these Manchus were the rightful rulers, and in fact, Wu Sangui again was one of them, and they resisted the Qing. They tried to, bring back the Ming Dynasty, and for nearly 40 years, the Qing were in control of the north, but they didn't have full control over all of China. It took around 40 years for them to gain control of all of China again. But once they did have control, you can see the massive amount of land that the Qing Empire controlled. So their old area of Manchuria, they had defeated the Northern Yuan dynasty, they held Tibet, and then here we see, the former Ming dynasty now completely consumed by this Qing dynasty. To help them rule over China, the Qing had both inclusive and exclusive policies. The inclusive policies were the emperor was still the central figure in society, so it's a continuation of the Ming idea, right? Where the emperor is the focal point. So the emperor is still going to be the focal point, but now the emperor happens to be a Manchu instead of a native Chinese man. And also, around the emperor, the bureaucracy is going to remain the same. And along with the exam system to fill that bureaucracy, the bureaucracy isn't going to be as dependent on eunuchs anymore, though. Instead, they're going to use that exam system to bring in their own people and to bring in some native Chinese. So Chinese were allowed into the lower levels of bureaucracy, so they did have some small share in governing. But kind of like what we saw with the Yuan dynasty, where remember how the Yuan were ethnically Mongol people, and so the Chinese kind of were in the lower levels generally. The same thing is happening in the Qing dynasty. The lower levels of the bureaucracy are being filled with these native Chinese men, but the higher levels are still kind of being reserved now. Instead of Mongols, they're being reserved for the Manchu. So those are the inclusive policies. The exclusive policies, the way that the Manchus excluded the Chinese from, participating fully in the state, I guess, is, the Manchu kept their own language and kept their own traditional clothing. So they were setting themselves apart from the Chinese in that sense. They did force the Chinese men to cut their hair in a traditionally Manchu style, which was called the queue. And here you can see the queue. You shave the front of your head, and then you have the back growing long into a pigtail. But this is pretty big stuff to force upon the Chinese, because during the Ming dynasty, men didn't cut their hair, but instead they put them up on top of their head through a top knot. And the reason why they did this was, again, Confucianism very large during the Ming dynasty, Well, there was a Confucian belief that a person shouldn't damage their hair because their hair was a gift from nature and from their parents. And in fact, it's kind of like it was just, you weren't supposed to cut your hair. So the fact that they were then forced to wear this Manchu hairstyle, cut some of it off, was a big deal. And people would be reluctant to do so. The Manchu's force of the Q upon the Chinese can be best summed up through a quote of, "To keep the hair, you lose the head. To keep your head, you cut the hair." So you have a choice. You can either stand by and not cut your hair at all and be killed, or you can cut your hair. Not surprisingly, people cut their hair. Intermarriage between Chinese people and the Manchu was forbidden, so a Manchu could not marry a Chinese person. And Manchu women also were not allowed to bind their feet in the traditional Chinese way. So there were some ways that the Manchu really kept themselves apart from the ethnically Chinese people who made up the predominant amount of people in China, right? The Kangxi Emperor played a very, very important role in China of uniting it. He was an important piece in the unification of China, of this new Qing dynasty over the ethnically Chinese people that they were ruling. He was also key in the expansion of China into more of Taiwan, more of Mongolia, Tibet. And he was the one who finally put down the revolts of the old Ming followers. So Wu Songui would be defeated by the armies of Kangxi. Once these revolts were put down in China, he then worked with the elites, the native Chinese elites, to help him govern. And during his 66-year reign, which is the longest in Chinese history, he ruled the longest, he brought in great stability and wealth into China. Some of the wealth was through the introduction of Western technology. Early on, Jesuits were welcomed into his court because they brought with them Western innovations. In fact, he was the first Chinese emperor to play a Western musical instrument, to know how to play a Western musical instrument. But his stance towards the Jesuits began to change once the Pope condemned traditional Chinese religious rites. And in fact, what he did was he banned Christian missionaries completely from China. The Kangxi Emperor also ordered the compilation of a dictionary of Chinese characters. This dictionary contains more than 47,000 characters, including some that were archaic and had fallen out of use. This here is an 1827 reprint of the dictionary. As time went on, China under the Qing dynasty began to feel more and more pressure from different peoples. Russia in the north of China was beginning to expand their territory, trying to reach the Pacific. So we see Russia here beginning their slow march this way, trying to reach the Pacific. Korea and Japan, so Korea and Japan in the east, and as well as Burma down in the southwestern area, really wanted to trade more with China and maybe to expand their territory as well, right? I mean, of course they're going to be open to expanding to gain more land. That's just the way most states seem to be. There was also a growing number of Europeans in Chinese port cities. These Europeans obviously wanted to trade with China, and one of the more insistent European countries was Great Britain. What did these Western traders want? Well, they wanted goods like porcelain. This is what we talked about again in exploration, as well as things like silk and other goods. But in return for these goods, China wanted really just one thing. So the West wanted silk and porcelain and spices and whatnot. China in return only wanted one thing, and that was silver. So this is kind of where I'm going to stop for this lecture. We're going to look a little bit more into China and their interactions with especially the Europeans in a later lecture in which we will see how Great Britain used its possession of India to force China to trade with Britain on the British terms. For now, that's where we'll stop. This is Greg, signing off.